Welcome back to the shop. So what I've decided to do is I just put a couple of jack stands on the ground and put them very forward on the motor mounts. And then I've just got something on the back that holds the back of the engine. I've left the chains on because what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the pilot bearing in, which means I got to give it a couple of strikes with a hammer to get the pilot bearing set. And just in case something goes wrong, that's why the chains are still on it. But once that's done, I can remove the chains and then we can start bringing the bell housing over and we can start doing our measurements. Now, before you even think of installing the pilot bearing on the end of the crankshaft, make sure it is a good fit on the end of the input shaft, right? So you want to make sure that's a nice tight fit. That's exactly what you want. It spins nice and freely. Obviously, we'll oil that up or grease that up later, but basically, we know it fits here. And we know it fits over there, so let's put this home. Now before I install this, there's a couple of options. This is a solid brass bushing, right? So there is no moving parts, right? But these will last forever as long as you don't sit there with your foot on the clutch all day, because the only time that the input shaft spins inside of this is when the clutch is depressed. Because when the clutch is engaged, the input shaft and the flywheel spin at exactly the same speed, so there's no wear and tear. So like I said, you have no problem with these. Now if you want to go with the roller bearing kind, go right ahead. It's up to you. But again, between the bushing and the roller bearing, personally I've never had an issue with the bushing. But whatever way you want to drive this home, as I said, never just take a big maul and start banging on this, because you will crush the inside diameter here because you will flatten it out by hitting it with a hammer. So what we want to do is simply put this in place and tap it in place. Okay, so I've just placed it in place. Now I put a little bit of blue Loctite on it. You really do not need that. The idea is this will sit in there and it will press in hard. But I always like to seal things up, and then when I have to remove this, or if I ever have to remove this, all you got to do is use your sliding hammer with a little hook on it and it'll pull right back out. But what I'm going to show you here is, like I said, I like to go around the perimeter of it, and again, never strike it right on the dead center. All right, so let's drive this home. Perfect. As you saw, I was going around the outside of it, never striking it dead center. Again, dead center will collapse the circle on you. You have to make sure you just go around and around and around, and it slowly works its way in. So what's the first measurement we can take to make sure that the stab depth of the input shaft is going to be right for this engine? So what I like to do is take a flat edge across the back of the crank, right? So this is across the back of the crank, and I'm going to put a ruler to the flat surface of the block, right? That flat surface, obviously, is the same flat surface that is on the bell housing. So when those two surfaces come together, plus the thickness of the spacer plate, we have to make sure that that input shaft is going to be actually in the engine the right depth, right? We can't have it too long or it's going to bind, and we can't have it too short or, of course, it's not going to work. So what I like to do is I take a flat edge right across the end of the input, the crank, and then I measure to the block, and what I have is I have about 5/8 of an inch, right? So over half an inch. So 5/8 of an inch from the end to the flat spot. Now, therefore, if I take the measurement from the input shaft to the outer flange of the bell housing, that distance should also be 5/8 of an inch minus the thickness of the spacer plate. Let's go check that out. Okay, so if we take a flat edge and put it up against, you'll notice that the input shaft sticks out a little bit further than the transmission, which is fine. Remember, this is going to have to go into that pilot bearing. Now we know we have 5/8 of an inch sticking out from the plane of the back of the engine. But again, that's fine as well, because 1/8 of that is going to be eaten up by the spacer plate, which means about a half an inch. So I've set my micrometer to about a half. I got 5.03. I mean, that's close enough. But basically, if I now take this flat bar and put it across and then go in that 1/2 of an inch, that comes right here on the input shaft, and that is perfect, right? Because remember, this is going to insert now into the end of the crank. The pilot bearing is going to work its way down to about this far on the input shaft, and I won't have any issues whatsoever with this binding with the pilot bearing. Now, here's the difference. This transmission is a T5 World Class built before 1994. And why is that important? Because if you're going to go with an aftermarket bell housing that was designed for a T5, you need the shorter input shaft. And that is because this bolts directly to the flywheel and therefore is further forward, and therefore you need that shorter shaft, which was before 1994. In 1994, Ford moved the engine and transmission a little bit more forward in the car, and therefore they had to bring the transmission a little further back. So they just made a longer bell housing in 94, and therefore what they did in 94 is they increased the length of the input shaft to compensate for that. So you cannot use a transmission from 94 or newer if you're going to go with this aftermarket bell housing. But if you have an original bell housing and you are going to convert to a T5 and you're going to use that spacer plate I talked about earlier, that spacer plate was designed to compensate for the additional length on the input shaft. So you therefore, if you're going to go with an original bell housing and a spacer plate or an adapter plate, then you have to buy a transmission that was made after 1994 because you need the additional length on the input shaft, because your adapter plate is going to push your transmission further back, and if you have the little short shaft like I do from 94 or older, it won't even reach your engine, right? So that's not going to work either. Okay, so as I said, before we get started, we have to put the spacer on. As I said, the spacer is about 1/8 of an inch thick, so that made up for that 1/8 of an inch for the insertion of the input shaft into the pilot bearing. Now, I had to buy a new spacer. The reason is that the old spacer is for an automatic transmission, and as you can see, it's missing the bottom. Now, the reason behind that is an automatic transmission, when you bolt the transmission onto the engine, you then have to bolt the torque converter onto the flywheel, and you need access to do that. So this little flange at the bottom snaps off so that you can have access to it. But with a manual transmission, you don't have that. Manual transmission, you bolt everything onto the flywheel, you make sure everything is good, and then when you mount the transmission, you're done. There's nothing else to adjust other than the thrower bearing, and we'll get into that. So, new spacer's like $116. Now, I got the universal one. The reason is it was the cheapest. I mean, it doesn't really matter, but basically this unit here is $116. I think that one that's designed specifically for the 289 was like almost $200. I mean, it's crazy. But basically, this will work fine, and as far as I'm concerned, it goes right on the dowels, and it goes right on, so it's perfect. Now, this next step is really important. All right, so this is the flywheel for this 289. It's 28-ounce balanced flywheel. It has 157 teeth, so the diameter is smaller. You got to watch. There's two types of flywheels. You're going to find 157 tooth and 164 tooth. 164 tooth's a little wider, but it will not work in this application. It won't actually even fit into the bell housing. So I had to make sure it's 157 teeth. I had to make sure it's obviously the right bolt circle. I have to make sure that it's the right counterbalance, right? Because we're running a 28-ounce offset on the crank. So this is exactly what we need to bolt onto the back of this. Now, you also have to be very careful because it is keyed. The bolts are not exactly perfectly centered, but neither are the bolts on the back of the crankshaft, and that's by design, so that when you put these two together, there's only one way that it will go on. And the reason is because that offset has to be in exactly the right spot. It's like a tire, right? If you don't put the balance on the correct spot, then you make it even worse. So this has to be oriented only one way and one way only. So let's get this on. Okay, so I put the flywheel on, and then I started to spin it, and I would put a bolt in, make sure the bolt went in, and then I would try to put the other 5 in. And if the other 5 didn't go in, You then took that first bolt out, rotated at one spot, and try it again, try it again, try it again. And you keep doing that until all 6 bolts go in without a problem. There's no binding on any of these. These all turn in nice and easy. Now that I have this oriented, and the reason it's so important that it's oriented is, of course, that 28-ounce offset for the crank, right? This can only go on one way, as I said. So now that I'm ready to go, I'm now going to pull the bolts out, and I'm going to go get my red anaerobic thread lock sealer. The reason it's important to do both, you obviously want a thread locker. You don't want these coming loose. But you also want a sealer, because these bolts enter the oil galley right behind the crankshaft. Those bolts that go into the back of the crankshaft actually enter into the oil area. And you don't want oil coming around the threads and getting out, because if it does, it's going to come right out here and get all over your clutch, and that's not going to be a good thing. So you have to seal these suckers. So I'm going to go get the red anaerobic, I'm going to seal these, we'll put them in, and then we'll torque them down, and then the flywheel is ready to go. Of course it's filthy, but I'll clean that with brake cleaner once we're ready to put the clutch in. But I'm going to get my hands all over this as I'm putting the flywheel on, and I'm going to be putting, you know, all sorts of gauges on here. So again, at this point in time, let's just bolt this in. Okay, so I've mounted the bell housing, and what I've done is I've put the dial indicator in. Now the dial indicator is simply magnetically stuck to the flywheel. But basically what I've done is I've got the dial gauge indicator showing up against the inside track of where the transmission centers itself. What we're trying to ensure is that this opening is centered to the flywheel, right, which of course is the pilot bearing, because the input shaft you want to make sure is as true as possible, because if the input shaft is being pulled from one side or the other, you could damage the pilot bearing, you could burn out the input shaft, the bearings on the input shaft, or worst case, I mean, it'll run your clutch off center, because the input shaft will force the clutch off to one side, so that when you're running your vehicle, your clutch might actually be off center and you're going to get vibration on that. So we just want to check for round. Now in this case, I've already bolted the bell housing on. This bell housing does not inherently have any adjustment to it because it's a Ford part. And the dowels are designed to bolt directly to a 302 block. So I'm hoping we're in good shape. But basically, if I did need to adjust this bell housing, the only way I could do it would be to remove the bell housing and take some of the aluminum off around the dowels to allow some play, because right now the dowels are very tight, so this bell housing is centered, or it's situated the way it is, and there's nothing I can do. Now some of you are looking at my video going, hey, this is deja vu. Well, this is actually a re-release of an original video that I had where I had mistakenly taken the readings already and found that the readings were way off. And what ended up happening is I added those readings together, and in fact, although you do add your readings together, you then have to divide by 2, because remember, you're working off of a center line. So any variations between the center line must be divided by 2 in order to get an accurate center line. And that's what I neglected to do last time. So what we're going to do is we're going to run this now, and you can see I am sitting straight up. My needle is at 0. Yes. So I'm going to move this engine 90 degrees, and as you can see, I had already put some runout numbers on there. So let's go 90 degrees to this point. And if we look at the gauge, the dial indicator is showing, actually I'm showing a 3 instead of a 4. So in fact, this is now a 3. So as I said, I had done this before. I have to thank Nick Moss over one of the subscribers to Joe Daddy's Garage. It's a great community we have. If you're watching this video and you're unaware of Joe Daddy's Garage, which is a channel, he has done a number of restorations on these old vehicles and has a lot of insight as well. So as you can see, as I said, we are 3/1000ths of an inch out at this point in time from 0. Let's move it another 90. And now we're straight up and down, and I am now reading about 1, 2, 3, maybe about 3.5, so 3, let's say, just to keep the number straight. So I'm 3/1000ths of an inch out at that point, and let's now rotate it another 90, which gives me 45. and we are at, so we're less than 5, we're about 4.5, which hasn't changed over here. Now, here's where I made a mistake on the original video. I took my 3 and my 4.5, I added that together and I got 7.5, let's say. The problem is you then take that 7.5 and you have to divide it by 2, because although the total is 7.5, it's the halfway mark that we're concerned with. And the halfway mark, of course, is half of the total. And even if you get the total, as long as that total is under 10, because the halfway mark will be 5, and 5,000th is the acceptable limit of any runout. So in my case, I've got 0, and then of course 3, so I've just got 3 total, which is 1.5, which is perfect, or 1.15 thousandth. And then from side to side again, if we're looking at side to side, we got 3 and 4.5, which is 7.5, and again you divide that by 2, so we're in the 3.5s or 3.75, and again well below the 5,000ths. So the way this bell housing is fine. I've got no runout issues. I won't have any issues with my input shaft. So like I said, thank you very much. I just wanted to show you how you can test for runout, and make sure you get these right by dividing by 2. Take the totals and divide by 2. That gives you your center line. And as long as that doesn't exceed 5,000ths of an inch, you're in good shape. So this is it for part 2. What I'm going to do in part 3 is take this bell housing back off, and what we'll do is we'll put the clutch on, and then center the clutch. We'll put the bell housing back on, and then we'll put the transmission in and see how all that goes together. So until then, thank you for watching. Hit that like button if you'd like, and I'll talk to you then.